Good morning, everyone. This is week 3 of Song of the Lark. Um, as usual, I'm a little behind, but it's just because I get hung up in all of the research, which is just so fascinating. One thing that I have here, and this is thanks to Sarah, who sent me a link about Olive Fremsted. That's the character on whom Cather seems to have based Taya. Olive must have been a peculiar woman. Taya isn't peculiar, but Olive Fremsted, it says here, she is a celebrated dramatic soprano of the early 20th century. She is remembered primarily as a Wagnerian. Born Anna Olivia Rundquist, she was adopted by an American couple named Fremsted and was raised initially in Christiania, Sweden, where she showed early talent on the piano. That's pretty parallel. The family moved to Minneapolis when she was 12, with Olive beginning voice training in New York at 19. Then she traveled to Berlin for further study with famed soprano Lily Lehmann. Her operatic debut came in the mezzo role of As You See Na at 1895 performance of Verdi. After 3 years there, she played Vienna, Bayreuth, London before returning to America, where she sang at New York's Metropolitan Opera 351 times between 1903 and 1914. Not an especially pleasant lady, her professionalism was nevertheless respected, and one legendary story speaks to her passion for perfection. Preparing for the title role in 1907 production of Richard Strauss's Salome, she wanted her dance with the head of John the Baptist to be realistic. Listen to this. The accounts differ, but in one version of the tale, she rehearsed with a calf's head obtained from a slaughterhouse, while in another version of the story, she used a human head that she somehow got from the New York City morgue. In the operas of Wagner, Olive reigned supreme. They list a bunch of the. She was the lead role in many performances. As was the case for some other sopranos, her rendering of Bizet's Cigarette Girl Carmen was not as well received, though she had some success with it, and indeed sang it with Caruso in San Francisco the night before the great earthquake of 1906. She retired in 1920 after Metropolitan General Manager declined to cast her as Lenore in Verdi's La Forza del Destino, then tried her hand at teaching, but apparently wasn't very good at it, even revolting her students by making them study the larynx in a severed head. Olive claimed no interest in romance, though she did have 2 brief failed marriages. Most of her fairly small output of recordings have been preserved on CD. Here's an end note. That weird curl there that's hanging on. Just get back in there. Most of her, her tombstone gives her year of birth as 1868, but most sources, including Grove's, lists it as 1871. Olive is neither the first nor the last lady of the theater whose true age is unclear. It's just some interesting tidbits about her. I also have some materials about the novel that kind of give us an overview. This is by Dorothy Tuck McFarland. It's an overview of the novel, but it gives us some insight. On reading the biography and criticism written on Willa Cather, one is struck with the variety of responses to both as a personality and as a writer. From the testimonies of those who knew her, especially her friends Edith Lewis and Elizabeth Sargent, she emerges as a warm, attractive personality, strong-willed, capable of deep friendships, loyal, self-confident, and generous. In contrast to this is the image of the older Willa Cather as an embittered and petty old woman who shut herself away from the modern world she intensely disliked. That would be later in her career. We're still looking at one of the early novels. This interpretation of her led so eminent a critic as Lionel Trilling to suggest that her self-conscious and defiant rejection of her own time must make her talent increasingly irrelevant and for any time. So that may have been her fate for a while. It became irrelevant, and yet we're seeing a resurgence now in interest in her books because they are not limited. A recent tendency has been to see in Willa Cather's work veiled and perhaps even unconscious reconstructions of her own personal anxieties and traumas. Thus, John Randall has largely interpreted her work in terms of what he feels was her failure to reach emotional maturity, her yearning backward to a vanished youth and a vanished era. But as we have seen in some of the later criticism, the pendulum swung the other way. Willa Cather was reticent about her private life. She refused to allow her letters to be published, though many of them may be read and are deposited in various libraries. She disliked publicity, and she was unwilling to become a public figure, even though she was a great popular and critical success. Her reticence has undoubtedly contributed to this critical eagerness to penetrate her reserve, to find out the quote-unquote truth by subjecting what evidence she did leave behind to a kind of psychoanalysis, the results of which seem at best to be mildly discrediting and to explain away more than they explain. So that is typical of her response to her for a number of decades. Her inevitable human failings, her weaknesses, her difficulties, the life problems she undoubtedly struggled with, probably are reflected in her work to some extent, but they are not the whole of it, and I think that's what's really relevant. Too much emphasis on this type of speculative biography seems to me, and that's the writer in this introduction, to remove the focus from her writing as art that points beyond itself and redirects our attention to the fallible human being who produced it. And I think that is the correct response to her works. When I was in graduate school, I had a professor who was very much and his interest was to dissociate from the text. He used to call it to evacuate the text. So we would be reading Shakespeare and we would take everything away, all the modifiers, all the dependent clauses, and get down to the noun and the verb. And it left an emptiness. And I think that is in some ways what happened to Cather's work. This author goes on to say, at her best, Willa Cather was capable of great artistry. This one no one denies. Her art lies primarily in her power to create with words vivid pictorial images that are imbued with an ineffable quality of felt reality. Oh, we certainly see this in this novel. And her narrative technique is essentially a juxtaposition of many images which work together to produce a cumulative effect and suggest something more than what is literally said. That is important. When we look at those long passages that in which the narrator gives us descriptions of the beauty of the Colorado that she saw, then we see the artistry of Cather. Her style is remarkable for its clarity and deceptive simplicity. Her use of words as a medium to convey images is so skillful that the words become almost transparent. Images are conveyed to one's mind so immediately that one has little sense of the fine craftsmanship of the prose with which they are built. And I think that is the essence of especially this novel. Um, I have a note to myself to keep going. It says keep going, so I will. It is not her artistry, then, that is in question, but the content of her works. Some critics have argued that the most prominent theme in her work, the celebration of the past of traditional values, however beautifully treated, make her work, as Trilling so devastatingly said of it, irrelevant. Um, and you hate to argue with Lionel Trilling, but I don't think he's correct. Um, Alfred Kazin, a generally sympathetic critic, accepts Willa Cather's right to her traditionalism but clearly stands apart from it himself. He discusses her traditionalism as a candid and philosophical nostalgia, and a lot of critics have taken her to task for the nostalgia of her setting and her characters from the past. The very intensity of which had given her the conviction that the values of the world she had lost were the primary values and everything else merely their degradation. I don't think that's what she was after. Here, I think, is the real core of the controversy over Willa Cather. The question of values. Kazin, who admires her as an artist, pronounces her values to be exquisitely futile. Elegiac and nostalgic are words often used to describe her work, acknowledging again the attractiveness of the past of which she wrote, but also implying the impossibility of the past serving any longer as a model in the modern world. And we know this, the Cather, this is one of the earlier novels, and we see some of the nostalgia and her distancing herself from the present, especially after the World Wars. Um, let's see, her theme was not the superiority of the past over the present, but as Henry Steele Commager has observed, the supremacy of moral and spiritual over material values. That is the nugget of truth here. The supremacy of moral and spiritual over material values. The ever recurrent but inexhaustible theme of gaining the whole world and losing one's soul. Rather than being irrelevant to the modern world, the moral thrust of Cather's art, her concern with pioneers and artists as symbolic figures representing the unending human quest for beauty and truth. That is the nugget of Taya. Um, the unending human quest for beauty and truth. This places her among the numbered, not of the backward looking, which she saw herself as being one of, but of the true spiritual pioneers of all ages in whose lives or work other men continue to find inspiration. Um, let's see. Everyone who fights for an ideal, whatever, although his ideal may seem to lie in the past, is driving the world on to the future, and the only reactionaries are those who find themselves at home in the present. Every supposed restoration of the past is a creation of the future. And I don't think it's possible to write in the past without bringing up some of the core values. And that's what Cather does. The march, as ever, is towards the future, and he who marches is getting there, even though he marches walking backwards. And who knows if that is not the better way. So this was an interesting overview of this controversy over Cather. Um, I'll get back to that more later. We have quite a bit of material here, as you can well imagine. It's the mad professor sitting here in my dining room, piles of stuff everywhere. It's horrible. It looks neat that way, but it doesn't look neat that way. It's it's all such a facade. You don't even know, but I'm wearing pink tennis shoes. Um, so I will come back to that. That some of the material that I gleaned from Jane. That will come back to. Okay, we get the Green Vine intro in the new book. I bought a book over the weekend. I think I told you this last week. Um, this is a collection of essays about the Song of the Lark, and it's edited by Deborah Cumberland. This I got it on Amazon, but there's some interesting points in this book as well. I'll be reading from some of these as we go, just depending on what is immediately relevant. Like today, I'm going to talk to you about the social topographies in the Song of the Lark. So, Deborah Cumberland, who is the editor of this, I forget where she's from. Not sure it actually said. I don't know. I don't think it says what university. It says something about Amsterdam, so this might be a collection that's international. But Cumberland writes, Willa Cather's The Song of the Lark was the first book I read about a talented, creative young woman who wanted to be an artist and actually followed through with it. That I thought was really a good observation. And she goes on to say, Anne of Green Gables marries Gilbert and writes occasional sketches. And Jo marries Professor Bear, and that seems to be the end of her scribbling in the attic. As I got older, I discovered the talented young women who drown genre. Isn't that interesting? But we saw that whole collection of short stories entitled Women Who Did. And it was interesting that she defined this genre as, and she's hyphenated it, talented young women who drown. And Taya does no such thing. Oh, I have to skip that sentence because it gives the things away. Taya gets sent off to Chicago with the money that Ray had set aside for her to study music. Taya struggles. Taya works very hard. Taya achieves her dreams. Taya delivers herself completely to her art. As a young teenager with dreams of being an artist myself, I found her story of hard work, tenacity, and most of all her triumph mesmerizing and inspiring. Decades later, coming back to the novel, I continue to admire the manner in which Cather's novel raises those central questions about women, artistry, love, marriage, and family. Cather's novel does not sugarcoat the journey. The Song of the Lark fundamentally asks what it takes to become a successful artist. And we're going to see Cather dropping us little hints about the pieces that go into making up Taya and the journey that she will go on. The Song of the Lark, when I read that, as Cather points out, no dream comes without a price. Taya achieves her dream, but the reader of the book is left to wonder whether narcissism is the cost of artistic success. Is it enough, or is Taya a cold shell? That's the question. Would we be asking the same question if Taya were a man? Isn't that an interesting point? Cather also asks questions of artistry by comparing Taya with her friends. And we've already met her odd assortment of friends. Most of Taya's friends in Moonstone are artists of one type or another. And one of them is Dr. Archie, in his own way, an artist. Mr. and Mrs. Kohler are artistic. Remember the beautiful, beautiful garden that Mrs. Kohler has created? Herr Wunsch, of course, he's an artist. And so is Spanish Johnny. each one an artist in their own ways. But Cather, I think, makes a distinction between them and Taya. It is the distinction between an artist who approaches his or her work to lose him or herself, and an artist who approaches the work to find his or her identity. So we even see, as early as we are still in the novel, that Dr. Archie isn't particularly satisfied with his wife. We'll see her today. Um, Remember, I think she's described as ugly with frizzy hair. Take exception to that, but um, she's skinny and not very pleasant, and she's also extraordinarily stingy. Despite the centrality of these questions about um, the artist and his approach to his or her art, Song of the Lark has received less critical attention than many of her better known works. That's true. Whereas with My Antonia and O Pioneers, the bounty of critical works is available. There's just mountains of it, and whereas there's less with this novel, even though in my mind, of course, I always like best the one that I'm reading right now, and so I like this best. There has in Cather's scholarship been a relatively fashionable focus on some texts at the expense of other. Okay. Cather herself looked back on the work and responded in the preface she wrote for the 1932 reissue of the novel to the chief complaints in regard to its style, as well as perceptions of Taya's increasingly less sympathetic nature as she grows into an artist. So we'll have to pay attention to that. Does she become less sympathetic? As Evelyn Funda notes, while the novel reflects the strength of German culture in the U.S. in its depiction of the Kohlers and other immigrant families, Lark's dearth of critical attention in, and Lark, she's using the word Lark just to refer to the novel. Lark's dearth of critical attention in comparison to other Cather novels may also have been due, in part, to anti-German sentiment that broke out in the country due to the sinking of the Lusitania in May in 1915, as well as the United States entry into World War I in 1917. So who knows? This may have just been a cultural response. A novel glamorizing Wagnerian opera may not have set well with many readers. Critics have also passed over their novel in favor of works characteristic of Cather's more spare style. I think I mentioned this either last week or the week previous, that some of the criticism of the novel has been in the long paragraphs uh, of her descriptions of the beauty of Colorado. Um, that didn't really bother me. Let's see. Let's see, was I supposed to read that? The Taya in the Rodolphi volume emerges as a complex, multifaceted creature, while at the same time challenging the more traditional interpretation of Taya as a creative, sexual being who finds her inspiration in the most thoroughly elaborated female landscape in literature. And they will have to just pay attention as she becomes the artist. Is Are we becoming more distant from her? Megan Burke's essay, for instance, argues against traditional feminist reading of Taya as the model of female artistic empowerment, instead articulating that the Song of the Lark is, in fact, a pessimistic account of female artistry and sacrifice. True artistic genius for women comes at the price of their essential embodied self. I found a lot of criticism in that feminist vein. I don't often care for it because it seems to me to be singular in its perception. But there is by the end of this novel, perhaps the conclusion that for the female artist, one can't have a family life. So we'll see. Was that too much of a sacrifice? We don't know yet. So let's see, what else do I have for you? This is the other article I was telling you about by Tony R. Magagna, and it's a place apart. That's the title of this article, transcending social topographies in the Song of the Lark. And this writer begins, Willa Cather's work has often emphasized the importance of place to individuals and communities living within the immense spaces of the American West. That, I think, is the point of those vast paragraphs of description. Um, in the Song of the Lark, Cather deploys similar themes to characterize Taya and her fellow Moonstone residents as they work to cultivate a sense of order and familiarity in the midst of the surrounding landscape. So we're going to see there's a critic named Yi Fu Tuan, YI-FU-TUAN. And I don't know if this is a man or a woman, so I'm not sure. This person writes about space and place. And I thought this was really interesting. We're going to see this, in fact, at work in this novel. One of the founding texts of human geography, open space, he says, or she says, has no trodden paths and signposts. So that's the space around Moonstone. It has no fixed pattern of established human meaning. It is a blank sheet on which meaning may be imposed. So what we have is the juxtaposition of space and place. Enclosed and humanized space is place, and what surrounds it is space. And that, in fact, it is the way Cather's setting works. This Moonstone, this teeny little town, is set down right smack in the middle of the American West. And Taya, in her wanderings around with the baby Tor, and when she goes to visit the Kohlers, she walks past these defined, humanized places. Taya's Moonstone represents just such an attempt to carve a place from open space. Isn't that interesting? Wait till you see this at work. Amid the surrounding desert, Moonstone seems a Noah's Ark town set out in the sand, and though brightly painted, it is frail against the dry, sparsely shaded landscape. Cather shows us the local landscape through Taya's adoring eyes as the young girl delights in her rare visits to the sand dunes. Sorry. Sorry. I again forgot to turn off the phone. I used the phone to hold my pages open, so I should probably just maybe bury it or put it somewhere else. But now I've turned it off. That was my mother. Just saying. Okay, so I don't know where I was. The young girl delights in her rare visits to the sand dunes. Yes, she goes out in and she and Ray go and explore the sand dunes. She relishes the sense of discovery and adventure away from the town. The harsh weather that besets the town evokes a sense that Moonstone is still a fragile settlement amid the immense open territory of the West. Yet the regular social and physical structures that the townspeople have erected amid the desert do represent a concerted and largely successful effort to settle a piece of the Western Territory and to mark it out for human endeavor. So we're going to observe this dichotomy between Moonstone, the place, in the middle of this space. Though Cather does not emphasize the struggle or the triumph of Moonstone's efforts to tame the land in the Song of the Lark, as she does with similar ventures in other works, the plotting and planting, remember in the Kohler's yard, that has taken place here among the Colorado sandhills is reminiscent of the efforts of her unvanquished settlers of the Nebraska plains, who are celebrated for their successes in marking and defining the open space of the West. The settlers, and those of you who were with me with O Pioneers, and especially O Pioneers, of the successful carving out of the American West and the pioneer um, savvy and strength in the face of those large landscapes. Um, let's see. Taya is allowed to fit up a little room for herself upstairs in the half story. She quickly discovers the pleasures of a place of her own. Does that sound familiar? That's Virginia Woolf, A Place of Her Own. But that is indeed what Taya likes. In fact, and we'll see this in a few chapters, when her father decides that Taya would be best served to become a piano teacher, he builds a room for her and offers it to her as a bedroom and a place to teach her pupils. Taya says no. She still wants her place upstairs, her place of her own. Decorated by her own hands and entirely her own, Taya's attic bedroom is her shelter from the storms of life, an ordered retreat from the chaos of adolescence and social demands. So, place is really fundamental here, and this is another reference to this critic Yi Fu Tuan has described the intimate experiences of home as universal. Hearth, shelter, home, or home base are intimate places to human beings everywhere. Their poignancy and significance are the themes of poetry and of much expository prose. Certainly, this poignancy of home is central to much of Cather's prose, and several critics, not the least among them is Judith Fryer in her studies of felicitous space in Cather's fiction, have traced the contrast between this type of placed intimacy and almost obliterative vastness of the West of the landscape. Mrs. Kohler's garden is an insulated island of moisture and greenness. And we'll look at this delicious little garden. In each of these cultivated places, I lost my place. These women are able to maintain a sense of shelter and at-homeness that is stripped from them in the outside world. Just as Mrs. Kohler is made stupid and blind, like an owl in the bright sunlight, in the open plain outside of her garden, so Taya, too, is never able to think as well as she can in her attic room, her sheltered place. And so that's this concept of place versus space, and the space is celebrated, and yet the characters return home to their own place. I think that's all I had in this article. Yeah. So we'll take a look at more of that in a bit. Let's go now. I think I have a few things here. We can. I don't know. No, my notes say see later, so we'll come back to that. Week 4. Let's take a look at the novel. Now we have some additional bits of interesting criticism that should give us some insight. I believe we ended on page 28, chapter 5. So if we begin chapter 5, the children in the primary grades were sometimes required to make relief maps of Moonstone in the sand. Um, and there's that concept. It's right there. Relief maps of Moonstone in the sand. Moonstone is carved out of the sand. Had they used colored sands, as the Navajo medicine men do in their sand mosaics, they could easily have indicated the social classifications of Moonstone, since these conform to certain topographical boundaries, and every child understood them perfectly. With this article now in my head about the the concept of place in Moonstone, this sheds some light on the topographies. The narrator tells us that there is the Society Street. To the west of this street, there's a main street, and then to the west of the street is the Society Street. And over on this, there's a third parallel with the main street on the west, was the longest in town, and the best dwellings were built along it. This I'm sure we can still identify, even in the 21st century, the different topographies. I have seen it really remarkably so in St. Louis, where you cross over a certain line and the neighborhoods deteriorate. And then you hop back on over, and the neighborhoods are home to large mansions, many of which were built for the 1904 World's Fair. They're along the park, the forest park, and they're immense. Many of them have carriage houses and the like, and yet if you go 3 or 4 blocks the other direction, you know, there's beat up apartment buildings. So I think we're all kind of aware of this topography, but given that that critic used that term, I thought it was really interesting. So she goes on to discuss, the narrator goes on to discuss the importance of these topographies and where the preacher's house faced the block. But I'm over on page 29. The preacher's house faced the backs of the brick and frame store buildings, and a draw full of sunflowers and scraps of old iron. And towards the end of this paragraph, Taya and Mrs. Kronberg had many friends among the railroad men who often paused to chat across the fence, and one of these we shall have more to say. We're also going to examine the role of the railroad in the novel. So we have to pay attention to that too. What kinds of things does the railroad bring? Over in the next paragraph, we see a portrait of the humbler side of the streets. These nestled modestly behind their cottonwoods and Virginia creeper. Their occupants had no social pretensions to keep up. So, in one place, I think we got to it last week. There's a description of some of these imported trees that that the settlers were bringing with them, including these cottonwoods and Virginia creepers. And here's picture of Taya. The people on Sylvester Street scarcely knew that this part of town existed. Taya liked to take Tor and her express wagon and explore these quiet, shady streets, where the people never tried to have lawns or grow elms and pine trees, but let the native timber have its way and spread in luxuriance. She had many friends there, old women who gave her a yellow rose or a spray of trumpet vine, and appeased Tor with a cookie or a donut. So this is what I mentioned earlier, that Taya used to like to explore it, and she would go from friend to friend. She did this as a child. Cather did, and we saw it in some other novels too, that these characters make friends with unusual characters. Taya does not go out to play with her peers. She makes friends with the artistic types like Dr. Archie and Spanish Johnny and the Kohlers. So if we go to the next page, here's a pic. This is where Mrs. Archie comes in. Taylor, Taya didn't like Mrs. Archie. Um, Then there's a reference in the next paragraph. She approached it very slowly. As we know, Dr. Archie asked her to come over and get some strawberries. She approached it very, very slowly, stopping often to pick dandelions and sand peas for Tor to crush up in his fist. I didn't know what a sand pea was, but apparently, if you eat sand peas, it inhibits the salivary glands, which causes very pronounced thirst. So it stops you from producing saliva. Isn't that interesting? Um, so anyway, in the next paragraph, we get some pretty funny descriptions of the missus. She was one of those people who are stingy without motive or reason, even when they can gain nothing by it. And then, let's see, there's a description down below of poor Dr. Archie can't get any cream for his milk because she waters it down. At the top of page 31, in the first complete paragraph, Mrs. Archie would not have a servant because, she said, they ate too much and broke too much. She even said that they knew too much. She used what mind she has, which she used what mind she had in devising shifts to minimize her housework. She used to tell her neighbors that if there were no men, there would be no housework. Not sure if that's true. I think that's kind of entertaining. It's a funny thought. So if there's no men, there's no housework. Well, I don't think that's true. Of course, I have a bunch of dogs, so they make a mess. Next few lines. If dust did not get in, it did not have to be got out, she said. So she shuts up all the windows and the blinds as soon as Dr. Archie goes off to doctoring. Shuts it entirely up so that no dust can get in. Why, nobody knew. Certainly her husband had never been able to make her out. Such little mean natures are among the darkest and most baffling of created things. There is no law by which they can be explained. I thought that was really funny. End of this paragraph, they live like insects, absorbed in petty activities that seem to have nothing to do with any genial aspect of human life. If you've ever had the misfortune of stepping on an ant nest, which I never had when I lived in Mequon, but here in Cedarburg, I have patches about that big of ants' nests, and if you ever step on one, the ants lose it. They just start going all over and up your pants legs, and so I don't know why there is more here than I've never even seen these things before. But talk about that kind of petty activities. If you go near it, they are running up your pants. Mrs. Archie, down below, she never talked much herself, but she knew all the gossip of the town, and she had a sharp ear for racy anecdotes, traveling men's stories. I thought we were going to get one, but we didn't. Towards the next, on page 32, about a third of the way down, I thought there was some really beautiful imagery here. Once she had married, and this is Mrs. Archie, whose name was Belle. Once she had married, fastened herself on someone, come to port, so to speak, it vanished like the ornamental plumage which drops away from some birds after the mating season, as if it's all a put on. But in fact, that's the way the narrator makes Mrs. Archie seem, is that she had all this plumage, she was there to attract a husband, got one, and then anything that was beautiful fell off. Of her harum-scarum spirit there was nothing left but a little screech. Within a few years she looked so small, and she looked as small and as mean as she was. Heather's sarcasm here is really apparent, and to me, it just struck me funny. At the top of page 33, she was a skinny little woman with a great pile of frizzy light hair on a small head. Um, let's see. Mrs. Archie, let's see. All right, so she has this very unflattering picture of her. Mrs. Archie, of course, we know she's stingy, and poor little Taya has come over to pick strawberries, and she has a big basket with her. But Mrs. comes back with a little wooden butter basket trimmed with fringed paper. I wasn't sure what a butter basket was either, but if you Google it, it's about this big. Now, mind you, poor Taya came over thinking she was going to collect a lot of strawberries, and the missus gives her a butter basket to put them in. As soon as she was sure that she was not going to cry, she tossed the little basket into the big one and ran Tor's buggy along the gravel walk and out of the gate as fast as she could push it. Um, and the mom, Mrs. Kronberg, tells her to get an ice cream soda. That'll make you feel better. I just thought that was a precious little bit from Mrs. Kronberg, and I'm sure that Cather's intent was to underscore what we already heard about Mrs. Kronberg, that she is sympathetic to Taya. She understands her. It's not so much a sympathy, but a comprehension. If we go now to page 34, um, whenever I find this really beautiful imagery, I write the word image in the margin, and I have one here. A few people were trying to make soft maples grow in their tufted lawns, but the fashion of planting incongruous trees from the North Atlantic states had not become general then, and the frail, brightly painted desert town was shaded by the light-reflecting, wind-loving trees of the desert, whose roots were always seeking water and whose leaves were always talking about it, making the sound of rain. Isn't that beautiful? Um, I have some more about the desert flowers. That comes later. But if we look at the top of 35, just below the gully was old Billy Beamer's grove, 12 town lots set out in fine, well-grown cottonwood trees, delightful to look upon or to listen to as they swayed and rippled in the wind. So I thought this was interesting in light of that article about space and place. And here, Uncle Billy Beamer's groves were carved again into the desert. One Uncle Billy had been one of the most worthless old drunkards who ever sat on a store box and told filthy stories. Isn't that hilarious? One night he played hide and seek with a switch engine and got his sodden brains knocked out. Oh my gosh. So, just she drops these characters and their portraits in. Um, let's see, and if we go over to the next page, at the top, looks to me like working pretty hard for your fun. Are you going to be busy tonight? Want to make a call with me? This is the doctor asking. Um, Spanish Johnny's come home again, all used up. Again, another really interesting characterization. His wife sent me word this morning, and I said I'd go over to see him tonight. He's an old chum of yours, isn't he? So we'll see. We'll see. Spanish Johnny reappear, but apparently he has the habit of going off and disappearing for a while, going on great drinking binges, and then he reappears. At the top of page 37, uh, Teo remarks about the books he's reading. She says they must be very nice. The doctor dropped back into his swivel chair, the mottled volume still in his hand. They aren't exactly books, Taya, he said seriously. They're a city. And we begin to see a little bit into the artistic nature of Dr. Archie. He's course, the medical man, but he's reading these books that are called A Distinguished Provincial in Paris. Um, this was by Balzac. I forgot that I have notes here. What chapter are we in? Let's see. I have a little description of this. Um, Yeah, A Distinguished Provincial in Paris, part two of Illusions Perdues, Lost in Illusions, by Honoré Balzac, from The Human Comedy, his series of novels about the different social classes in early 19th century France. Balzac, who is regarded as the originator of realism in the novel, had enormous influence on later writers, including Henry James. Cather deeply admired both Balzac and James. That's kind of an interesting little tidbit here because she drops in the character of she drops into the characterization of Dr. Archie, his love of these books and the realism. Um, they're talking about the books. Are they city people or country people, she asks. And he says both. People are pretty much the same everywhere. Oh, no, they're not, she says. The people who go through in the dining car aren't like us. My guess is, and I couldn't really find anything to explain that, um, except that those must be the richer people or the people who are going on up to perhaps the equivalent of the first class area in the plane. Um, they always get better meals, and we get a bag of nuts. People who are in the back. Just saying. Anyway, on the next page, page 38, the doctor carries his straw hat as they walk toward Mexico Town. Remember, there was something last week about how, or was that in the notes that I have for today? How suddenly the Mexicans created their own little Mexico town, gradually moving north from Mexico and populating their own area. And this is where Spanish Johnny is. Next paragraph, Spanish Johnny was the first Mexican who came to Moonstone. He was a painter and a decorator. And there's his artistry. He also values music. End of this paragraph. The Mexicans had arrived so quietly with their blankets and musical instruments that before Moonstone was awake to the fact there was a Mexican quarter, a dozen families or more, with their blankets and musical instruments. I'm sure you can picture those beautiful multicolored blankets. She didn't even have to describe it, and I'm sure a picture came to your head. Um, Next paragraph. As Taya and the doctor approached the adobe houses, they heard a guitar and a rich baritone voice, that of famous Serenos, singing La Golondrina, which is a popular song written in 1862, and it's entitled in English, The Swallow. All the Mexican houses had neat little yards with tamarask hedges and flowers. And if you've ever been to the Spanish Quarter in this city, in fact, I frequently have Spanish-speaking students in my college classes, and one woman described the Spanish Quarter, and she said everyone's houses are painted a different color, and that when you leave the Spanish Quarter, it becomes dull and quiet, whereas in her area it is multicolored, and you can hear the music through the windows. I just pictured this paper this woman wrote, based on even this small description. We see Spanish Johnny on page 39. Spanish Johnny looked younger than his wife, and when he was in health, he was a very handsome. He was very handsome, slender, golden colored, with wavy black hair, a round, smooth throat, white teeth, and burning black eyes. His profile was strong and severe, like an Indian's. Uh, so we know that this novel was written more than 100 years ago. And if this were written now, the author might be accused of stereotyping. And yet we're just getting a straightforward discussion of what Taya sees. Um, the His wife says, "Mi testa," which means my husband. "Mi testa, doctor." And let's see, he's over on the bed. Seeing the doctor's companion at the foot of the bed, he muttered a smile. "Muchacha," he exclaimed deprecatingly. Muchacha means little girl. So Spanish Johnny's laying there in something of a drunken stupor, and he sees his little friend, Taya, at the bottom of this page. Mrs. Telemantes was always considered a very homely woman. That's too bad. Her face was of a strongly marked type, not sympathetic to Americans. Such long, oval faces with a full chin, a large, mobile mouth, a high nose are not uncommon in Spain, but something that is maybe foreign looking. And I think that's the point the narrator is making. She was chiefly known, I'm on the next page, 40. She was chiefly known in Moonstone for her forbearance with her incorrigible husband. Um, so he goes off with his musical instruments, plays in bars for a while, drinks a great deal, and then comes home. His popularity would have been unusual for a white man. For a Mexican, it was unprecedented. His talents were his undoing. He had a high, uncertain tenor voice, and he played the mandolin with exceptional skill. Periodically, he went crazy. Um, so we see his artistry, and that's, again, one of the characters that Taya picks for her friends. Down at the bottom of this page, public sentiment was lenient toward Johnny, but everyone was disgusted with Mrs. Telemantes for putting up with him. She ought to discipline him, people said. She ought to leave him. She had no self-respect. In short, Mrs. Telemantes got all the blame. Well, we know from many other examples of women characters that Mrs. Telemantes couldn't leave her husband. She couldn't. And Mrs. Telemantes is Mexican to boot. So likely her culture would have forbidden a divorce or having left her husband. At the top of page 41, she was thinking that there was nothing so sad in the world as that kind of patience and resignation. Taya is thinking this about Mrs. Telemantes. It was much worse than Johnny's craziness. She even wondered whether it did not help to make Johnny crazy. People had no right to be so passive and resigned. Well, the narrator is telling us something about the determination in Taya that she already possesses as a child, and that will become part of her determination in her future. And we see this by her thoughts about this poor Mexican woman who's stuck with this fella who goes bananas. Next paragraph, "I can't see what makes him behave so. He's killing himself, and he's not a rowdy sort of fellow. Can't you tie him up some way? Can't you tell when these fits are coming on?" And Mrs. Telemantes put her head on her forehead. "The saloon doctor, the excitement, that is what makes him. People listen to him, and it excites him." So, again, another little crumb that we are going to see later in Taya, because in Spanish Johnny, the audience is what excites him. And Taya is later going to become someone who thrives in the face of in the front of the audience. Down at the bottom of this page, she says, He is always fooled. The Mexican woman spoke rapidly and tremulously, her long underlip quivering. He is good at heart, but he has no head. He fools himself. You do not understand in this country. You are progressive, but he has no judgment, and he is fooled. So that is perhaps call it a Shakespearean fatal flaw. He's fooled in this case. He's got this great artistry, but it comes to nothing. Um, there's another passage about the conch shell. Or she picks up this conch shell and she says, "Listen, doctor, you hear something in there? You hear the sea, and yet the sea is very far from here." I think that's a beautiful analogy. You have judgment and you know that, but he is so fooled. To him, it is the sea itself. A little thing is big for him. Not sure if you see that my dog has reappeared. At the top of the next page, 42, um, the sound in it startled her. It was like something calling one, so that was why Johnny ran away. There was something awe-inspiring about Mrs. Telemantes and her shell. Taya learns this from Mrs. Telemantes. Um, that, that analogy about the conch shell describes what happens to poor Johnny. Um, Next chapter. Here's some descriptions about Ray Kennedy. It says there was a worthy man in Moonstone who was already planning to marry Taya as soon as she should be old enough. So I think right about here she's 15. And it's too young, but it's curious. This is a curious relationship. His name was Ray Kennedy. His age was 30, and he was a conductor on a freight train, his run being from Moonstone to Denver. Again, the train. I do have an article for you about what this train brings, but it brings civilization. He was an aggressive idealist, a free thinker, and like most railroad men, deeply sentimental. Taya liked him for reasons that had to do with the adventurous life he had led in Mexico and the Southwest, rather than for anything personal. So she's not smitten with him, he's smitten with her, but they have a great friendship in the stories that Ray brings. I'm going to have to pause. I'm not sure what my nutty dog wants, but she's going to keep going. I'll be right back. But I have figured out how to pause instead of having to stop and then start another one up. So I'm going to pause. Look at that. I resumed. Sorry. Apparently, Daphne decided that was the moment that she had to go out. The problem is, I can't even let them out because it's still -7. Um, Problem solved. Um, so where was I? Oh, yes. At the top of page 43, there is a reference to the turquoise hills. One of the things that Taya gets from Ray, or the symbiotic relationship, is that they explore space. But anyway, the turquoise hills. Let's see, where am I? Oh, yeah. The sandhills of north-central Nebraska are rich in minerals and fossils, but are now mostly grass-covered. Some of these details, petrified wood, desert vegetation, agates, colors, bear close resemblance to Arizona's painted desert, which Cather had recently visited. Remember, she had that trip to visit her brother, which really had a lasting impact on her. Towards the right in the middle of the page, there is a reference to a phrase which was supposed to be derogatory. Let's see, when they left Mexican Town, Taya was on the front seat with Ray and Johnny, and Gunnar and Axel sat behind with Mrs. Telemantes. Here they're going on a journey out to space. They objected to this, being in the back, of course, but there was some things about which Taya would have her own way. As stubborn as a Finn, Mrs. Kronberg sometimes said of her. Um, that is a mild ethnic slur, not against the inhabitants of modern Finland, but against the nomadic Lapps, a group that differs racially, culturally, and linguistically from other Scandinavians. The Sami, or the Finns, who traveled the northern regions of Finland, Sweden, and Norway, once known as Finnmark, with their reindeer herds, have suffered a history of discrimination much like that of the Native American tribes in North America. That was an interesting bit of information. So Mrs. Kronberg is saying that Taya is as stubborn as a Finn. She said, let's see, Taya gave them a business-like nod. Wunsch came to the gate and looked after them. She to the Kohlers, and looked after them. He divined Ray Kennedy's hopes, and he distrusted every expedition that led away from the piano. So apparently, it's well known that Ray has his eye on Taya. And the father mentions it even a bit later. As Ray Kennedy's party followed the faint road across the sagebrush, so they're moving more and more away from place, and the road is now becoming very faint. They heard behind them the sound of church bells, which gave them a sense of escape and boundless freedom. Escaping from back in place to space. Every rabbit that shot across the path, every sage hen that flew up by the trail was like a runaway thought, a message that one sent into the desert. On page 44, at the end of the incomplete paragraph at the top, beyond the phantom lake lay the line of many-colored hills, rich, sun-baked yellow, glowing turquoise, lavender, purple, all the open pastel colors of the desert. And then they find themselves in this area called the Cup. I think that is fictional. Let's see if I have a reference to it. Yeah, I think that's a fictional. Some of the locations that appear in the book are real, and some are fictional. Moonstone is based, of course, on Cather's own small town. At the top of page 45, Mrs. Telementes smiled and said something to Johnny in Spanish. Yes, her husband replied, translating. They say in Mexico, kill a snake, but never hurt his feelings. What an interesting proverb. Down in the hot country, muchacha, turning to Taya, people keep a pet snake in the house to kill rats and mice. So that's an interesting say. So you don't want to offend a snake. Oh, presumably he's going to come back to bite you. And here's cultural difference. Gunnar sniffed with disgust. Well, I think that's a dirty Mexican way to keep a house. So there. There's cultural differences, of course. Johnny shrugged. Perhaps, he muttered, a Mexican learns to dive below insult or soar above them after he crosses the border. Yeah, there's some certain prejudices. In the next paragraph, Mrs. Telementes took out her drawn work and pinned it to her knee. And drawn work is ornamentation of lines formed by drawing parallel threads and uniting the cross threads to form a pattern. I think it's something like, what's it called? Needlepoint, where you just go in rows. Gunnar, no. Towards the bottom of this page 45, I began to browse around early. This is Ray who's speaking. I had a mind to see something of this world, and I ran away from home before I was 12. Wrestled for myself ever since. So that's where he gets all of the stories that he conveys, stories and histories that he conveys to Taya. On page 46, down at the bottom of the page, Ray had a collection of good stories. He was observant, truthful, and kindly, perhaps the chief requisites in a good storyteller. That's his artistry, is being collecting and telling stories along the railroad, of course. At the top of page 47, there is by the light. There's a reference here to some authors of the period. But by the light of the many campfires, he had pondered upon Prescott's histories and the works of Washington Irving. We know Prescott is he's an American historian who wrote epic-style, romanticized histories of Spain and Spanish America, including a 3-volume History of the Conquest of Mexico from 1843. And then we know Washington Irving wrote, he's best known for the History of New York and the Sketchbook, a compilation of essays and folk tales. In the 1830s, he traveled to the western frontier, describing his adventures in A Tour on the Prairies. And it just so fits Ray, because that's the kind of thing that he, of course, enjoys. Then a few lines later, there's a reference to Robert Ingersoll's speeches and the Age of Reason. Ingersoll was an American politician known as the Great Agnostic because of his long campaign on behalf of free thinking. His lectures, which criticized the Bible from a rationalist point of view, had an important influence on American thought in the late 19th century. It's just giving us a little bit of insight into what he likes. The Age of Reason, of course, is by Thomas Paine, which affirmed the existence of God on the basis of the arguments of design and first cause. Paine urged respect for God's creation, but not for the Bible or for institutionalized churches, which he accused of calumny and manipulation for profit. So it tells us about Ray. He's a man who lives in space, who is not imposed upon by the confines of place churches. Remember, they just left the church bells behind. He brought with him from all his wanderings a good deal of information, more or less correct in itself, but unrelated and therefore misleading, a high standard of personal honor, and a sentimental veneration for all women, bad as well as good, and a bitter hatred of Englishmen. I think probably because they're foreign and different and potent and maybe arrogant. Taya often thought the nicest thing about Ray was his love for Mexico and the Mexicans, and he could speak Spanish fluently. At the top of the next the next page, 48. Let's see, what's the right on? I don't know. I underlined that. I didn't tell myself. At the top of page 49, these are everyone's thoughts when they are set free from Moonstone. Everyone was busy with his own thoughts. Mrs. Talamantes was thinking of the square in the little town in which she was born, the white church steps with people genuflecting as they passed. It does tell you that she's Catholic. And round-topped acacia trees and band playing in the plaza. Ray, so we're getting a point of view from each of them, and it's as if they are merging. Ray was thinking of the future, dreaming the large Western dream of easy money, of fortune kicked up somewhere in the hills, an oil well, a gold mine, a ledger of copper. It's reminiscent of the gold rush of 49. He always told himself when he accepted a cigar from a newly married railroad man that he knew enough not to marry until he had found his ideal and could keep her like a queen. Well, he thinks he's found his ideal in Taya. We'll see how that marches on. Yeah, there's a reference about 2/3 of the way down to where the wagon trails and 49ers and the Mormons were still visible. 49ers, we know about them. They're the thousands of prospector lured west by the California gold rush of 49. 2 years before, in 1847, 16,000, I did not know that, 16,000 Mormons, members of the Church of the Latter-day Saints, had made the largest single migration in the history of the nation. Isn't that interesting? Following their leader, Joseph Smith, they traveled from New England across Nebraska to Utah. Their wagon wheel scars are still visible today on what is known as the Mormon Trail. I did not know that there were that many. 16,000. That is an enormous migration. My daughter recently moved from Seattle to St. Louis, she and her husband and baby, and they, out of fear of the virus, drove cross country. And one of their stopping places was in Utah. And my daughter made the observation that there were a lot of Mormons. I'm not sure how she knew that, but there must have been a lot of Mormon churches. And I'll be right back. 1 second. Okay, not sure why the dog is being pesky today. So anyway, that's where they landed. That's where the Mormons landed. Is in Utah, Salt Lake City. If we go to the next page, page 50. What does my notes say here? Oh yeah. She told herself she would never forget it. The spirit of human courage seemed to live up there with the eagles. I think this is probably something that Cather felt when she visited her brother and so enjoyed, became so immersed in the setting. Oh, yeah, go up a few lines. Westward, the course of empire takes its way. And that, yeah, this says, this phrase, part of a larger message that was first telegraphed across the Missouri River in 1860, is the opening line of the poem on the prospect of planting arts and learning in America by the Anglican bishop George Berkeley, famous as an idealistic philosopher. The poem, written in 1723 to promote Berkeley's never-realized scheme to found a college in Bermuda that would train American Indians to serve as Christian missionaries to their own tribes. So the point of it is that westward the coast of the empire takes its way. He had been in the room where the instrument began to click, and all the men there had, without thinking what they were doing, taken off their hats, waiting bareheaded to hear the message translated. And the message, of course, is this idea from Mr. Berkeley. If you go to over on page 51, as they drove homeward, the stars began to come out, pale yellow in the yellow sky, and Ray and Johnny began to sing one of the railroad ditties that are usually born on the southern Pacific and run the length of the Santa Fe and the Q system before they die, to give a place to a new one. This song was about a greaser dance. Greaser is a derogatory term for Mexican or Spanish American. The greaser dance, the refrain being something like this: Pedro, Pedro, swing high, swing low, and it's Alamand left again. And there's boys that's bold, there's some that's cold, but the gold boys come from Spain. Oh, the gold boys come from Spain. I looked that up, trying to see if that was a real song. It may be. I couldn't find it, but it's just something that speaks to the musicality of Spanish Johnny, and also the camaraderie between Ray and Spanish Johnny. Ray is more immersed in the culture than most of white settlers, but that's likely because he was a train man. I marked for myself here something that was quite beautiful at the beginning of chapter 8. Winter was long in coming that year. Throughout October, the days were bathed in sunlight. I just really like this imagery. I'm sure you can hear my dog. I don't know what's her problem. The town kept its cheerful summer aspect. The desert glistened with light. Okay, I have no idea why my dogs are misbehaving. Anyway, I like the beauty of this detail. This is probably one of the passages that critics took to task, but I think it really paints the picture. The scarlet sage bloomed late in the front yards. The cottonwood leaves were bright gold long before they fell, and it was not until November that the green on the tamaracks began to cloud and fade. There was a flurry of snow about Thanksgiving, and then December came on warm and clear. Especially given our current amounts of snow and the temperature, I think this appeals to me. The last time I looked when I was in there because somebody was misbehaving, it was 7 below. So we go over to the next page, and there's a description of Tia's place upstairs. She did not really mind this because she was allowed to use the money, her pupils paid her 25 cents a lesson, to fit up a little room for herself upstairs in the half story. I could just picture that. I use my attic as storage, and it is a half story. Even and I'm only 5'2", on a tall day, bang my head on the rafters, and I think that's what she's looking at. It was the end room of the wing and was not plastered, but was snugly lined with soft pine. The ceiling was so low that a grown person could reach it with the palm of the hand, and it sloped down on either side. There was only one window, and it was a double one and went to the floor. In October, while the days were still warm, Taya and Tilly papered the room, walls and ceiling to the same paper, small red and brown roses on yellowish ground. Again, it's the detail. Um, uh, the paragraph goes on, as you know, to describe the furnishings she's got. And if you go over to page 53, when Taya first plunged in between her red blankets, the cold sometimes kept her awake for a good while, and she comforted herself by remembering all she could of polar explorations. That is Washington Greeley took a party of 25 to Ellesmere Island in 1881. Planned relief parties failed to reach them, and only 7 survived until they were rescued in 1884. Greeley's 1885 account, 3 years of Arctic service, an account of the Lady Franklin Bay expedition of 1881 to 84, told of buffalo skin sleeping bags that thawed while occupied, but froze solid to the ground when living bodies left them. So she's remembering their hardship in order to make her warm and take her mind off of how cold it is upstairs. Let's see. Next paragraph. The acquisition of this room was the beginning of a new era in Taya's life. This is one of those passages that you should star in the margin. It was one of the most important things that ever happened to her. She's beginning just a little to separate. You can see that separation. With the rest of the other 6 kids are, except, well, later Anna gets her own bedroom, but all those kids are piled up in one room. It's kind of like what it's like around my house when everybody comes over. Let's see, hitherto, except in summer, when she could be out of doors, she had lived in constant turmoil. The family, the day school, the Sunday school, the clamor about her drowned the voice within herself. Again, star that, because she has now acquired enough of a place to be able to develop the artist in her. She had certain thoughts which were like companions, ideas which were like older and wiser friends. I just don't even know what's going on. Okay, we go to the next page, 54. From the time when she moved up into the wing, Taya began to live a double life. During the day, when the hours were full of tasks, she was one of the Kronberg children, but at night, she was a different person. The artist in her is becoming. It's becoming, I suppose we could say. On Friday and Saturday nights, she always read for a long while after she was in bed. She had no clock, and there was no one to nag her. Spanish Johnny says that girl is developing something fine. And let's see, there's a just about her when Ray calls her. Um, I was looking for this passage, and I'm pretty sure that they are calling her Tay, not thee. Um, At the end of the paragraph, Taya sighed and submitted. She was always helpless before homely sentiment and usually changed the subject. Um, Not sure what. Yeah, it is Tay, and that's the way. That's what Ray calls her as a shortened up version of Taya. My note here says. Um, In the Scandinavian languages, Taya's name is pronounced Taya, as we've been saying, as her baby brother's Tor's name is pronounced Tor. Um, we already knew that. I'm not even sure why I underlined that. Probably because my dog is distracting me. Um, this reference at the top of page 55 to WCTU. This is the um, Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was established in 1874 for the protection of the home, the abolition of the liquor traffic, and the triumph of the golden rule in custom and law. Well, we know what happens with temperance. Eventually, that became legitimate temperance. You couldn't even buy liquor. Um, Mrs. Johnson was a prominent Baptist, and Lily Fisher was the Baptist prodigy. Uh, there was not there was a not very Christian rivalry between the Baptist church and Mr. Kronberg's church. LOL. Um, so if we go into the next paragraph, let's see. As she delivered this thrust, her eyes. Oh, that was about Lily. Here's this competition between the two. Um, Lily seems to me to be something like who is that character in Little House of the Prairie? The one with the blonde pigtails? Um, oh, I wrote her name down somewhere. You know, the one that was the brat. Oh, I'll remember it. Just hold it with me. Mrs. Johnson disapproved of a child whose chosen associates were Mexicans and sinners, and who was, as she pointedly put it, bold with men. So I wondered if Cather was going to make a reference to that this unusual child has befriended adult, for the most part, adult men. Um, I have a note for this. Oh, the Ancient Mariner, of course, we know as the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. The mariner accosts wayfarers to hear his tale. By thy long gray beard and glittering eye, asked the narrator, now wherefore stoppest thou? And you probably know the story of the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. It's a story that he is condemned to repeat over and over. Down at the bottom of page 55, he insisted, let's see, because his orchestra was to play for the concert, Mr. Wunsch imagined that he had been put in charge of the music, and he became arrogant. He insisted that Taya should play a ballad by Reinecke. That reference is Karl Reinecke. He's a German composer, teacher, and pianist, composed many exercises for young pianists. When Thea consulted her mother, Mrs. Kronberg agreed with her that the ballad would never take with a Moonstone audience. This is a whole discussion of the competition between Lily and Thea. Clearly, Thea has more artist and is a better vocalist than Lily, but Lily has the ear of the parish, um, and she connives. She connives to make it so that she herself, Lily, gets the best ovation. Um, and if you look over on page 57, in that paragraph that is the first complete paragraph, um, this is more about the discussion between the characters about selections from Hermione and the Polish boy, and when it was over, everyone breathed more freely. No committee had the courage to leave Tilly off a program. She was accepted as a trying feature of every entertainment. I thought that was funny. The Progressive Ochre Club was the only social organization in town that entirely escaped Tilly. Tilly is, the sister-in-law, um, and helps care for the Kronberg children, and seems she's that proverbial spinster, but somewhat odd. Then if we go into the next paragraph, there's just a word that I didn't know. It was Ray is sitting in the back watching this Christmas program, this church program, and he's sitting with his friends, the Mexican, and they get an uproarious given uproarious applause, and it's called, he says, from Ray's clackers. Those are professional applauders. So, of course, they're going to applaud most for Taya, is essentially what that was supposed to mean. Over on page 11, oh no, I gotta turn my page. On page 11, there's an explanation here of this song that Lily is singing. Rock of Ages cleft for me carelessly the maiden song. And my notes tell me here it's a popular hymn. Rock of Ages, of course, was incorporated into a recitation combining the speaking or singing voice with a piano, published in the family. It just tells that it was published. Let's see. Cather quotes the text incorrectly, substituting carelessly for thoughtlessly. Just so you know that. Rock of Ages cleft for me thoughtlessly the maiden song. This particular chapter has a lot of notes, end notes. Mid next paragraph, she sang the song of Home Sweet Home, the song that touched my heart. That reference is a popular written song by Jules Jordan, published in 1887. All of these details fill in the nature of this concert. The Baptist, and this funny competition between the Baptists and the preacher, Mr. Kronberg. The Baptists had everything their own way. Next paragraph, when shepherds watched. That is a reference to While Shepherds Watch Their Flocks by Night is based on the St. Luke's version of the Christmas story. The most popular melody used for it in America is Sherborne, a fugue by Daniel Reed, in case you wanted to know that. Down at the bottom, when shepherds watch, I already read that. As a family, they somehow seemed a little less ridiculous, trooping along in the starlight. There were so many of them, for one thing. Then Tilly was so absurd. She was giggling and talking to Anna, just as if she had not made, as Mrs. Kronberg admitted, an exhibition of herself. Poor Tilly. It's kind of like, I'm sure mostly everybody has gone to the kids' holiday programs at the in December, or the spring programs, when there's always one kid who's singing louder, more emphatically than any other kid, and it becomes somewhat ridiculous. If it's in a child, it's charming, but in poor Tilly, not so much. Lily Fisher, I'm on page 59. Lily Fisher was pretty, and she was willing to be just as big a fool as people wanted her to be. Very well, Taya Kronberg wasn't. She would rather be hated than be stupid any day. That little tough personality coming through. Okay. How far off am I? Oh, pretty bad. Well, let's take a look at one more chapter. I've been going for more than, oh, 1 minute 35. Actually, I think we'll stop here. Um, Maybe next week I'll have to speed things up a little bit. There was just so many things to take a look at. Um, oh, yeah, yeah, I think we'll stop here because this next chapter is only a couple of pages long, but I've been going for quite a while, and um, my dog is so distracting to me. I don't even know why. I in my college classes last week, my students had to give a speech, and they're all online, but the students still have to do their speeches. And one poor woman was doing her speech and doing it well when her cat walked across the screen, which we all thought was hilarious, but it was kind of difficult for her to recover. So anyway, we will stop here. I'm going to try to speed things up just a little bit so that we don't get too awfully behind, because it'll be difficult to catch up. If you have questions, feel free to email me, and that's all I have. Hope everybody is well. Don't go outside, it's too cold. Maybe I didn't leave Daphne out long enough. I don't even know. So I will talk to you next week, and I will start uploading this to YouTube right now. Bye.